Part 1. She thought it was just a mistake, but to the Mafia Boss she was the best thing that ever happened. Rain fell heavy over the city that night, the kind of rain that made every street look like a mirror. Inside a tall glass building on the 40th floor, a woman named Grace Miller stood in front of a copy machine, holding a folder tightly against her chest. Grace was 25 years old. She had soft brown hair, tired eyes, and the kind of quiet nervousness that came from working too many hours for too little pay. She was not rich. She was not powerful. She was simply an assistant at a private law firm, the kind of firm that handled papers for very rich and very dangerous men. She did not know that tonight, one small mistake would change her entire life. It started with a folder. A plain black folder left by accident on the wrong desk. Grace picked it up without thinking twice. She believed it belonged to her boss, Mr. Adler, who had asked her to prepare documents for an important client meeting the next morning. She placed it inside her bag, planning to drop it off early before anyone noticed. She had no idea that the folder did not belong to Mr. Adler at all. It belonged to a man named Damien Cross, one of the most feared men in the entire city. A man whose name alone made grown businessmen shake. A man who ran an empire built on secrets, money, and blood, hidden behind the polished walls of legal offices and expensive suits. Grace worked late that night, finishing small tasks, refilling coffee, printing papers no one would read until morning. By the time she left the office, the rain outside had grown heavier. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the parking garage, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement. She did not notice the black car following slowly behind her. She did not notice the man standing near the elevator, watching her with sharp, calculating eyes. Damien Cross had been expecting his folder to arrive through a very specific, very secure channel. When it did not appear at the scheduled time, alarms went off inside his mind. Not panic exactly. Damien Cross did not know panic. But a deep, focused attention, the kind of attention that came right before something dangerous happened. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and colder, sharper eyes than anyone Grace had ever seen. He wore expensive suits that fit him perfectly, the kind of suits that made him look like a businessman on the surface. But underneath that calm exterior was a man who had ordered things done that most people could not even imagine. A man feared not because he shouted but because he never needed to. When his men reported that the folder had been mistakenly taken by a young assistant from the floor below, Damien said nothing for a long moment. Then he simply said, "Bring her to me." Grace was walking toward her car when two men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the parking garage. She froze immediately, her heart pounding hard against her chest. "Miss Miller," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "We need you to come with us." I don't understand," Grace stammered, backing away slowly. "Who are you?" "We work for Mr. Cross," the man said. "You have something that belongs to him." Grace's mind raced. The folder. She had thought nothing of it, just a simple mistake, a wrong desk, a wrong bag. But the way these men looked at her, the seriousness in their eyes, told her this was not a simple mistake at all. "I can give it back," she said quickly, reaching for her bag. "I didn't look inside it, I promise. I just picked it up by accident." The two men exchanged a look. Then one of them said, "Mr. Cross would like to hear that from you directly." Grace felt her stomach drop. She had heard the name Cross whispered in the hallways of her office before, always in hushed, careful tones, the way people spoke about something they were afraid of. She had never seen his face. She had never wanted to. But now, standing in the rain with two dangerous-looking men on either side of her, she realized she had no choice. They led her to a black car waiting at the edge of the garage. The windows were tinted so dark she could not see inside. One of the men opened the back door for her, and Grace hesitated only a second before stepping in, her hands trembling around the strap of her bag. Inside the car, waiting silently in the shadows, sat Damien Cross. He did not smile. He did not offer any kind of greeting. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes studying her carefully, as though he were reading every nervous movement she made. "You took something of mine," he said finally, his voice low and steady. I didn't mean to," Grace said quickly. "It was an accident. I thought it belonged to my boss. I have it right here, I can give it back right now." She reached into her bag with shaking hands and pulled out the black folder, holding it out toward him. Damien looked at the folder for a long moment before finally taking it from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers briefly, and Grace felt a strange chill run through her, though she could not tell if it was fear or something else entirely. "Did you look inside?" he asked quietly. "No," Grace said immediately. "I swear I didn't open it. I didn't even know what it was." Damien studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of a lie. But all he saw was fear, honest and raw, the kind of fear that could not be faked. For a long moment, the car was silent except for the sound of rain hitting the windows. Then Damien said something Grace never expected to hear. "You're not in trouble, Miss Miller?" Grace blinked, confused. "I'm not." Damien's eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary. Something about this simple, nervous woman, someone with no idea who he truly was, someone completely outside of his dangerous world, struck him in a way he could not immediately explain. "No," he said quietly. "In fact, I think you may be exactly what I need." Grace had no idea what those words meant. She only knew that her simple, quiet life had just changed forever, and there was no going back. Grace sat frozen in the back seat of the car, staring at Damien Cross, waiting for him to explain what he meant. But he said nothing more. He simply looked out the window, watching the rain fall over the city, as though the conversation had already ended in his mind. "What do you mean, exactly what you need?" Grace finally asked, her voice shaking slightly. Damien turned his head slowly and looked at her again. His eyes were calm, but there was something behind them, something calculating, like a man solving a difficult puzzle. "I run a very large business, Miss Miller," he said. "One that requires people around me who are honest. Do you know how rare that is?" Grace shook her head slowly, unsure of what to say. "Very rare," Damien continued. "Most people who work close to me want something. Money. Power. Protection. You wanted none of that. You picked up a folder by mistake, and the moment you realized it wasn't yours, you tried to return it immediately. You didn't open it. You didn't hide it. You told the truth the second you were asked." "Because it's the truth," Grace said quietly. A small, almost invisible smile touched the corner of Damien's mouth. "Exactly." The car pulled up outside Grace's apartment building a few minutes later. She hadn't even told them her address, yet somehow they already knew exactly where she lived. That thought alone sent a cold shiver down her spine. "How did you know where I live?" she asked carefully. "I know many things, Miss Miller," Damien said simply, without any further explanation. One of his men opened the car door for her. Grace stepped out into the rain, her legs still shaking slightly from everything that had just happened. Before she could walk away, Damien spoke once more. "You will be contacted tomorrow," he said. Grace turned back, confused. "Contacted? For what?" "A job offer," Damien said simply. Then, without waiting for her response, he tapped the door twice, and the car pulled away into the rainy night, leaving Grace standing alone on the sidewalk, completely stunned. That night, Grace barely slept. She lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of what had happened. She thought about the two men in dark suits. She thought about the black car with tinted windows. Most of all, she thought about Damien Cross himself, his calm, controlled voice, his sharp eyes that seemed to study everything around him. She had heard whispers about him before at the office. People spoke his name quietly, almost afraid to say it too loudly, as though speaking it might summon him somehow. Some said he owned half the businesses downtown. Others said his true business had nothing to do with law or finance at all, but something far more dangerous. Grace had always dismissed these rumors as exaggeration, the kind of stories people told to make ordinary businessmen seem more exciting than they really were. But after tonight, after sitting in that car with him, she wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, exactly as Damien had promised, Grace received a phone call. It was not from Damien himself, but from a woman with a crisp, professional voice, introducing herself as his personal assistant. "Miss Miller," the woman said politely, "Mr. Cross would like to offer you a position within his private office. The pay is significantly higher than your current salary, and the work would be far less demanding than what you currently do." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "What exactly would I be doing?" "Administrative work," the woman said simply. "Organizing his schedule, managing certain documents, ensuring his daily operations run smoothly. Mr. Cross values discretion and honesty above all else. He believes you possess both qualities." Grace hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. Every instinct told her this was a bad idea. She had heard enough rumors, seen enough fear in her coworkers' eyes whenever his name was mentioned, to know that working closely with a man like Damien Cross came with serious risks. But then she thought about her small apartment, her mounting bills, the endless late nights at a law firm that barely paid her enough to survive. She thought about the exhausted feeling that had settled into her bones over the past few years, working herself thin for a life that never seemed to get any easier. "Can I have some time to think about it?" Grace asked carefully. "Of course," the assistant replied smoothly. Mr. Cross will expect your answer by tomorrow evening. The call ended, leaving Grace standing in her small kitchen, staring blankly at her phone. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who exactly was Damien Cross? What kind of business was he really running? And most importantly, why had he chosen her, a simple, ordinary assistant, someone with no real power or connections, to work so closely by his side? She spent the entire day distracted at work, barely focusing on her usual tasks. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Damien's calm, calculating expression staring back at her, the way his sharp eyes had studied her so carefully in the back of that car. By the time evening arrived, Grace found herself standing outside her apartment building, staring up at the dark, cloudy sky, trying to decide what to do. She thought about walking away completely, ignoring the offer, pretending none of this had ever happened. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. But something deep inside her, some quiet, curious part of her mind, kept pulling her back toward the memory of Damien Cross's voice, calm and steady, saying the words that had changed everything. You may be exactly what I need. Grace took a deep breath, staring at her phone in her trembling hands. Then, slowly she began to type her response. Grace pressed send before she could change her mind. The message was simple. I accept the position. She stared at the screen for a long moment after sending it, her heart pounding heavily in her chest, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The reply came almost instantly. Mr. Cross will expect you at his office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. A car will be sent to collect you. Grace barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what tomorrow would bring. She thought about her old job at the law firm, the tired eyes of her co-workers, the long hours that drained her energy every single day. She thought about the strange, careful way Damien Cross had studied her in the back of his car, like he was trying to solve something hidden underneath her ordinary exterior. The next morning, exactly at 8 o'clock, a black car pulled up outside her apartment building. Grace stepped outside, wearing the most professional outfit she owned, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the car door herself before the driver could reach it. The drive was quiet. The driver said nothing, and Grace didn't try to make conversation either. She simply watched the city pass by outside her window, tall glass buildings glowing under the gray morning sky, until finally the car pulled up outside a massive skyscraper she had never noticed before, tucked quietly between two ordinary-looking office buildings. Inside, everything was polished marble and dark wood, the kind of place that whispered money and power without needing to say a single word. Grace was led through a private elevator, up to the very top floor, where two guards stood outside a large set of double doors. When the doors opened, Damien Cross stood waiting behind a massive desk, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been the night before. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice steady. "Please sit." Grace sat down slowly across from him, folding her hands nervously in her lap. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Cross." "Damien," he corrected simply. "We will be working closely together. There's no need for such formality." Grace nodded, though something about hearing his first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, one she quickly pushed away, reminding herself exactly who this man really was. Over the following days, Grace learned quickly that her new job was nothing like her old one. The hours were long, but the tasks themselves were simple. Organizing meetings, managing certain documents, overseeing schedules that seemed to stretch across cities she had never even visited. But it didn't take long before Grace began noticing things that unsettled her. Certain meetings were held behind closed doors, ones she was specifically told never to enter. Certain phone calls were spoken entirely in hushed, careful tones, always ending the moment she walked into the room. Certain men who visited Damien's office carried themselves with a kind of dangerous energy she had never encountered before, the kind of men whose eyes made her feel unsafe just from a single glance. Grace tried her best to ignore these small details, focusing instead on the work directly in front of her. But one evening, working late organizing files in Damien's private office, she overheard a conversation through the thin wall separating his office from hers, one that made her blood run cold. "The shipment was intercepted," a rough voice said. "We lost almost everything." "How much?" Damien's voice replied, calm but sharp. "Nearly 2 million, the man answered. "The Petrov family is already asking questions." There was a long pause before Damien spoke again, his voice low and controlled. "Find out who talked. And when you do, make sure it never happens again." Grace stood frozen outside the door, her hands trembling around the folder she was holding. She had heard enough rumors to understand vaguely what kind of business Damien Cross truly ran, but hearing it confirmed so clearly, so calmly, sent a wave of fear rushing through her entire body. She quickly stepped back from the door, pretending to busy herself with paperwork at her desk, her mind racing with everything she had just overheard. Later that evening, after most of the office had emptied out, Damien appeared in the doorway of her small workspace, studying her carefully. "You heard something tonight?" he said simply. It wasn't a question. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She considered lying, pretending she hadn't heard anything at all. But something about the way Damien looked at her, calm and patient, waiting for an honest answer, made her realize lying would be pointless. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I did." Damien studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what do you think of me now, Miss Miller?" Grace hesitated, unsure of how to answer such a dangerous question. "I think," she said slowly, "that you are not the kind of man I originally believed you to be." "No," Damien agreed quietly. "I'm not." For a long moment, neither of them said anything else. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with unspoken questions neither one seemed ready to ask. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before. "Are you afraid of me now?" Grace considered the question carefully before answering honestly. "A little," she admitted. "But not as much as I probably should be." Something flickered behind Damien's dark eyes, something Grace couldn't quite name. For the briefest moment, the powerful, controlled mafia boss standing in front of her seemed almost human, almost vulnerable, in a way she never expected to witness. "Good," he said quietly. "Because I don't want you to be afraid of me, Grace." It was the first time he had ever used her first name. And somehow, hearing it spoken so gently from his lips, Grace felt something shift deep inside her chest, something she wasn't entirely sure she was ready to understand. The weeks that followed changed something quietly between them, though neither Grace nor Damien spoke of it directly. Grace continued her work in the private office, organizing schedules, filing documents, learning the rhythm of a world she once believed only existed in movies. But now, every evening before leaving, Damien would find some small reason to speak with her. A question about her day. A comment about the weather. Small, ordinary conversations that felt strange coming from a man capable of the things she now knew he was capable of. Grace told herself she should be careful. She told herself that a man like Damien Cross was dangerous, that anyone close to him lived a life full of risk. But despite every warning inside her mind, she found herself looking forward to those quiet moments at the end of each day, when the mask of the powerful, controlled boss slipped away just slightly, revealing something softer underneath. One evening, working later than usual, Grace sat alone in the office, exhausted from finishing a difficult set of financial reports. She hadn't noticed Damien standing quietly in the doorway until he spoke. "You should go home," he said gently. "It's late." Grace looked up, rubbing her tired eyes. "I just need to finish this last file." Damien walked over, taking a seat in the chair across from her desk, something he had never done before. "You work too hard, Grace." "Says the man who is usually here later than me," Grace replied with a small, tired smile. Damien's lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a real smile Grace had ever seen from him. "Fair point." They sat quietly for a moment, the office empty except for the two of them, the city lights glowing softly through the tall windows behind Damien's desk. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said carefully. Damien nodded once. "Of course." "Why me?" Grace asked. "Out of everyone you could have hired, why did you choose someone so ordinary?" Damien studied her carefully before answering, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Because ordinary in my world is incredibly rare. Everyone around me wants something. Power. Money. Protection. You wanted none of that. You were simply honest even when you didn't have to be." Grace felt her cheeks warm slightly under his intense gaze. "That's it? Just because I was honest?" "That," Damien said quietly, "and because from the very first moment I saw you, something about you made me want to protect you rather than use you." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected such an honest answer, especially not from a man like Damien Cross. Before she could respond, the sound of the office door opening startled them both. A tall man in a dark coat stepped inside, his expression tense and urgent. "Boss," the man said quickly, "we have a problem." Damien stood immediately, his calm expression shifting instantly into something sharper, more focused. "What happened?" "The Petrov family," the man said. "They know about the missing shipment. They're demanding a meeting tonight." Damien's jaw tightened. He turned briefly toward Grace, his expression softening only slightly. Go home, Grace. I'll handle this. Grace nodded quickly, gathering her things, though her heart pounded nervously in her chest. As she reached the doorway, she paused, looking back at Damien one last time. Be careful, she said softly. Damien met her eyes, something unreadable flashing behind his gaze. I will. Grace left the building quickly, her mind racing the entire drive home. She had heard the name Petrov mentioned before, always in hushed, careful tones among Damien's men, always accompanied by a look of quiet tension. She didn't fully understand who they were, but she understood enough to know they were dangerous, and that tonight Damien was walking directly into danger because of her. She spent the rest of the night unable to sleep, staring anxiously at her phone, waiting for any sign that Damien was safe. Around 3 in the morning, her phone finally buzzed with a message. It's handled. Get some sleep. Grace let out a long breath of relief, her hands trembling slightly as she read the message over and over again. She hadn't realized just how worried she had become until that very moment, holding her phone tightly against her chest. The next morning, Grace arrived at the office earlier than usual, anxious to see Damien and confirm for herself that he was truly unharmed. When she stepped off the elevator, she found him already sitting behind his desk, looking as calm and composed as always, though there was a slight tiredness behind his dark eyes that hadn't been there before. You're here early, Damien said, glancing up from his paperwork. I wanted to make sure you were okay, Grace admitted honestly. Something flickered softly behind Damien's expression, an emotion Grace couldn't quite name. I'm fine, Grace. Thank you for worrying. Grace hesitated by the doorway, unsure of what else to say. Finally, she took a small step forward. Damien, I know this isn't my place, but is it always going to be this dangerous? Damien set down his pen slowly, studying her carefully. Yes, he admitted honestly. It is. Grace swallowed nervously, unsure of how to respond to such an honest answer. But, Damien continued softly, I promise you this. As long as you are near me, nothing and no one will ever hurt you. That I can guarantee. Grace felt her heart tighten at his words, a strange mixture of fear and comfort swirling together inside her chest. She realized, standing there in his office, that whatever was happening between them had already grown into something far more complicated and far more real than she had ever expected. Part 5. She thought it was just a mistake, but to the Mafia Boss she was the best thing that ever happened. 3 months passed since Grace first stepped into Damien Cross's world. She had learned to move through his office with quiet confidence now, no longer flinching at the sight of dangerous men entering through the private elevator, no longer holding her breath every time she overheard a tense phone call through the thin office walls. She had learned, slowly, to accept the truth of who Damien was, without letting it change the way she felt about him. And that feeling, whatever it was, had only continued to grow. It was a quiet Friday evening, most of the staff already gone for the weekend, when Damien invited Grace to stay behind for dinner in his office. It wasn't the first time they had shared a meal together, but tonight felt different somehow, the air between them heavier with something unspoken. You've been quiet all week, Damien observed, watching her carefully across the small table set up near his window. Grace pushed a piece of food around her plate, gathering her thoughts. I've been thinking about something. What is it? The Petrov family, Grace said carefully. I heard some of your men talking earlier. They said something about a meeting tomorrow night. A dangerous one. Damien's expression grew serious, though he didn't look away from her. Yes. There's still unfinished business between us. Is it going to be like last time? Grace asked, unable to hide the worry in her voice. Possibly worse, Damien admitted honestly. He had learned over these past months that lying to Grace never felt right, even when the truth was difficult to hear. Grace set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. Damien, I know I have no right to ask this, but please be careful tomorrow. Damien reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her so intentionally, and Grace felt her breath catch at the warmth of his skin against hers. I will always be careful, he said softly, because I have something now that I never had before. A reason to come home safely. Grace looked up, meeting his dark eyes, her heart pounding heavily in her chest. What reason is that? Damien's gaze softened, something vulnerable flashing behind his usually guarded expression. You, Grace. You are my reason. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected for weeks now that her feelings toward Damien had grown into something far deeper than simple curiosity or fear, but hearing him confirm his own feelings so openly left her speechless. Damien, she started, but before she could finish, he leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't move, he gently pressed his lips against hers, soft and careful, as though she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. Grace melted into the kiss without hesitation, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart pounding just as fast as her own beneath her fingertips. When they finally pulled apart, Damien rested his forehead gently against hers, his breathing slightly unsteady. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted quietly. "Me too," Grace whispered back, a small nervous smile crossing her lips. For a moment, the dangerous world surrounding them seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the quiet warmth between them. But the peace didn't last long. The sound of Damien's phone buzzing sharply against the table broke the moment completely. Damien sighed, reluctantly pulling away to answer the call. Grace watched his expression change instantly, the softness disappearing, replaced once again by sharp, controlled focus. "When?" Damien asked into the phone, his voice tense. There was a pause before he responded again. "Understood. I'll handle it." He ended the call, turning back to Grace, his expression serious once more. The Petrov family moved up the meeting. Tonight instead of tomorrow. Grace's stomach twisted with worry. "Tonight? Damien, is that safe?" "No," Damien admitted honestly. "But it's necessary." Grace stood quickly, her hands trembling. "Then let me come with you." Damien shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, Grace." "I don't care," Grace said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I won't just sit here and wait, wondering if you're going to walk through that door again." Damien studied her carefully, a mixture of concern and admiration flashing behind his dark eyes. Finally, he sighed heavily, recognizing the same stubborn determination in her that had first caught his attention months ago. "You'll stay in the car," he said firmly. "No matter what happens inside, you do not leave that car." "Understood." Grace nodded quickly, relief flooding through her chest. "Understood." Within the hour they arrived at an old warehouse on the edge of the city, the kind of place hidden far enough from prying eyes to make dangerous business dealings possible. Grace sat nervously in the back of Damien's car, watching him disappear into the shadows of the building alongside several of his men, her heart pounding heavily with every passing second. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Grace stared anxiously through the window, gripping her phone tightly in her hands, praying silently that everything would go smoothly. Then suddenly, the quiet night was shattered by the sharp sound of gunfire echoing from inside the warehouse. Grace's entire body went rigid with fear. Before she could stop herself, she pushed open the car door, ignoring Damien's earlier warning completely, and ran toward the sound of chaos unfolding just ahead of her. Grace's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe as she ran toward the warehouse doors. The gunfire had stopped almost as quickly as it started, but the silence that followed felt even more terrifying. She pushed through the heavy metal door, ignoring every warning Damien had given her, her mind filled only with fear for his safety. Inside, the warehouse was dim, lit only by a few hanging lights swinging slightly from the ceiling. Several men lay on the ground, some groaning in pain, others completely still. Damien's men stood scattered around the room, weapons still raised, checking corners cautiously. "Damien!" Grace shouted, her voice trembling with panic. "Grace, get back!" one of his men yelled, spotting her immediately. But Grace didn't listen. She kept moving forward, scanning the room desperately until her eyes finally landed on him. Damien stood near the far wall, breathing heavily, a small cut above his eyebrow, blood trickling slightly down the side of his face. But he was alive. He was standing. Relief flooded through Grace so quickly her knees nearly buckled. "Damien," she breathed, rushing toward him. Damien turned sharply at the sound of her voice, his expression shifting instantly from tension to complete shock. "Grace, what are you doing here? I told you to stay in the car." "I couldn't just sit there," Grace said, her voice shaking as she reached him, her hands immediately checking his face, his arms searching frantically for any serious injury. "I heard gunshots. I thought." "I'm fine," Damien said quickly, gently taking her trembling hands into his own. "I'm fine, Grace. Look at me. I'm okay." Grace let out a shaky breath, tears filling her eyes as the fear finally began to release its grip on her chest. "You could have died." Damien's expression softened, his thumb gently brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "But I didn't. Because I had every reason to make sure I came back to you." Behind them, one of Damien's men cleared his throat awkwardly. "Boss, the Petrov situation is handled." Their men surrendered once they realized we came prepared. Damien nodded once, though his eyes never left Grace's face. Good. Make sure everything is cleaned up properly. As his men moved quickly to handle the aftermath, Damien gently guided Grace outside, away from the chaos, toward the quiet safety of the night air. They stood together near the car, the cool breeze slowly calming both their racing hearts. You shouldn't have come, Damien said softly, though there was no real anger in his voice, only quiet concern. I know, Grace admitted. But I couldn't lose you. Not after everything. Damien pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close against his chest. You won't lose me, Grace. Not now. Not ever. For a long moment, they simply stood there together, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the quiet night sky, the dangerous world around them finally feeling still and peaceful, if only for this one moment. Weeks passed and slowly life began to settle into a new, quieter rhythm. The Petrov conflict was resolved permanently, an uneasy peace established between the two powerful families, ensuring safety at least for now. Grace continued working alongside Damien, though their relationship had grown far beyond simple business into something neither of them had expected, yet both had come to cherish deeply. One evening, months after that dangerous night at the warehouse, Damien invited Grace to dinner at his penthouse apartment, the first time she had ever been invited somewhere so personal. The apartment was quiet, calm, filled with soft lighting and the gentle sound of music playing from somewhere nearby. This is beautiful, Grace said, looking around the elegant space in quiet admiration. Not as beautiful as you, Damien replied smoothly, causing Grace to blush deeply, a small laugh escaping her lips. After dinner, they sat together on the balcony, overlooking the glittering lights of the city below. Damien took Grace's hand gently in his own, his expression suddenly more serious than she had seen in weeks. Grace, he began carefully, I need to ask you something important. Grace turned toward him, her heart beginning to race nervously. What is it? Damien took a deep breath, his usually calm and controlled demeanor slipping slightly, replaced by something far more vulnerable. I know the life I live is dangerous. I know that being close to me puts you at risk every single day. But these past few months have shown me something I never expected to find, especially not from something as small as a mistaken folder left on the wrong desk. Grace felt tears building in her eyes, listening carefully to every word. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Grace, Damien continued softly. And I don't want to imagine my life without you in it anymore. Grace's heart swelled with emotion, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now. Damien, I feel exactly the same way. Damien smiled gently, the kind of genuine, unguarded smile Grace had rarely seen from him before. Then stay with me, Grace. Not just as someone who works for me but as the person who stands beside me, through everything. Grace didn't hesitate. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. Damien leaned forward, capturing her lips in a slow, tender kiss beneath the glittering city skyline, the dangerous, uncertain world around them fading quietly into the background. What had begun as a simple mistake, a wrong folder left on the wrong desk, had somehow become the greatest turning point of both their lives. Grace had once believed her ordinary, quiet existence made her invisible in a world full of danger and power. But to Damien Cross, the most feared man in the entire city, she had become something far more important than mere business or convenience. She had become his reason to keep fighting. His reason to come home safely every single night. She had become, simply put, the best thing that had ever happened to him.